Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us here on Ask the Agronomist this morning. We're about a minute early here, but we went ahead and open things up. Trying to get the picture squared up for you here so that I'm not all cockeyed on you. Producer Adam will be joining us momentarily, so apologize. We're getting a little bit of a shaky start here. So just as a reminder for those of you who maybe haven't been on before, if you want to live chat in your questions, please log in with either a YouTube account or a Gmail account. Any Google email address will get you logged in to YouTube Live here, so you can live chat in questions. That is always the goal of our Ask the Agronomist program, is to answer your live questions and find out what's on your mind. I've got some stuff on the board here behind me just to remind me of a few things that I wanted to talk about. Unfortunately, it's rainy and wet, so hoping for a big crowd here today on Ask the Agronomist, since there's not a whole lot we can do in the field. And start off here with maybe a little bit of a weather update. I checked with a few folks this morning. Based on climate rainfall totals, it sounds like the western part of the state generally got more moisture than the eastern part of the state did, which that's kind of the inverse of what we have seen throughout a lot of the spring here so far. The western part of the state's got more crop in the ground and has had more days that were almost fit to plant than the eastern side of the state has. But sounds like from like Jacksonville west, about an inch or a little more was a fairly common rainfall amount. We had 6 to 8 tenths across our acres in Knox, Warren, and Fulton County. And then as you go further east, Springfield, maybe half an inch or so. And when you get as far east as Champaign, some people saying as little as 2 tenths. So I think some of us got a little more rain than others, which is typical. My forecast has got more rain Friday, more rain Sunday. Hopefully we don't fall into that, rains on Easter Sunday, rain for 7 Sundays kind of pattern. Some of you might have had snow on Easter Sunday, and I think we've joked about that. What year was that? Was that just last year that we had? It was like it snowed on Easter Sunday, and then for 3 Sundays after that, we had snow. Man, that was a couple years ago. But anyway, it's going to be a while, looks like, before we get back out in the field. Producer Adam is joining us now. So morning, Adam.
Morning.
So he'll get logged in and be able to address your text questions as they come in. The reality is, it's going to be a while before we get back in the field. In most cases, next week's forecast looks fairly cool. Not going to be ideal for drying. Not a lot of rain in my forecast for next week. But starting to get questions about how do we manage through what might be a late planting season. We get awfully nervous awfully quick about it being a late season. It's the 21st of April. It's not late at all. And even if we're planting 10 days from now, that's not late either. But it is later than we like to see. And I think we get so wrapped up in timely planting, we can sometimes forget that that's one factor in 100 plus that's going to determine your yield. And I'll share a quick story just from my own operation. I was going through some historical yields I've got a new crop insurance agent I'm working with this year. And I realized that the corn I planted on June 11th in 2019 yielded 20 bushel to the acre more than the corn I planted on April 17th on the same farm in 2021. So obviously in some parts of the state, 2021 was not a good corn year, and we had lots of issues with, you see crown rot up on the board here. Pretty good conditions for crown rot out there right now and next week as well. So we'll spend a little time talking about that. But, obviously there were factors that were far more important than planting date last year that impacted, corn yield. There are factors that are far more important than planting date every year that impact corn yield. Soybeans are, probably arguably a little more sensitive to planting date than maybe corn is. But, we can raise awfully good corn and awfully good soybeans planted in May. So there's not really any reason to panic. There was some guys that like to be funny on Twitter putting some surveys out just as kind of a joke, asking guys, if you can't plant beans in April, will you still be able to farm next year? And the I think option D on the multiple choice was no, I've already called Sullivan's. And so there's some good natured joking going on out there about our inability in some cases to get April planted soybeans in the ground. Kind of relative to that, I have had this question a lot. You might have had the plan of planting soybeans first, or starting with soybeans and then switching to corn partway through. And that might have been your plan when you thought you were going to start planting in early April. If you can't start planting until, let's say, late April, do you still do some soybeans first, or do you just start with corn? And that's going to be a totally personal decision. Agronomically, I could tell you there's probably rationale for still starting with some soybeans, even if it's late April before you're able to start. A couple reasons for that. Oftentimes when we start a couple days before we should start, and conditions are a little bit marginal. So if you're anticipating pushing conditions a little bit when you start, I'm a lot more comfortable with you pushing conditions on soybean planting than I am on corn. So that would be a reason to maybe plant beans for a couple days when you start in April. And again, these comments are kind of geared towards people that have one shared planter that plants both crops. The other thing I would say is, there's really not a lot of data to support that, late April corn has any advantage over early May corn. There is data to support that late April beans do tend to have a little bit of an advantage over May beans. So, if you can start in April, and if you'd like to start with soybeans, and there are reasons why you could maybe make yourself feel like you're doing the right thing if you do go ahead and start with soybeans. When the calendar turns to May, I'm going to say that, just our cultural beliefs and feelings about corn being, kind of our primary crop. And if you've got crop left to plant in June, you'd probably a lot rather that be soybeans than corn. And so I think once we get into May, the risks are elevated beyond the point where I would start with soybeans. I'd probably be focused on corn once the calendar turns to May. And if you're able to get some beans planted first, great. Get the corn in when, focus on corn, get it done. And then hopefully we can still get soybean planting finished up in a relatively timely basis. So, soybeans respond, soybeans are kind of interesting in the fact that they respond better to early planting, but they also withstand late planting better than corn. So I would say corn likes the sweet spot in the middle. And if you're early or late, I'd rather it be beans. And so for those reasons, once we get into May, I'm going to say let's focus on corn. But regardless of which crop you're planting, it's way too early to be slopping stuff in the mud and making a mess out of things. Planting conditions trump everything as far as I'm concerned. So do your best to be patient. I know as the later it gets, the harder it gets to be patient. But even in 2019, there was some corn planted in that June window that probably 2 or 3 days before it was really fit, but people were desperate. And I think in some cases there was evidence that even if you waited a few days in June and let it get fit, that was better than planting corn in the mud in June. So planting in the mud is rarely going to benefit your crop. So just something to keep in mind. Just so I don't forget this, I like to make fun of myself on Ask the Agronomist this morning, and you can't see that I'm wearing unlaced tennis shoes, and you didn't notice that I limped into the room here today. But a quick farm safety update, that's top on the list here. This might surprise you, but I've never been very coordinated. And as I get older, I find I'm even less coordinated. So I don't know if any of you are experiencing that or not, but I tripped getting out of a side-by-side working on some fence a couple nights ago after my day job. And I should have just fell down, but I tried to keep from falling down. So if you ever stumbled and tripped and caught yourself and tried to regain your balance, and while you're trying to keep yourself from falling, you fall worse because you're trying not to fall. and this might have come from this phrase might be attributed to John Madden play-by-play, but are you familiar with the rumbling, bumbling, stumbling kind of image? That was me trying to keep from falling, and in the process, I badly sprained my right ankle. So I'm a little gimpy. Been elevating and icing, and selfishly, I'm a little bit glad that I can't be planting today, because if I could be planting today, I wouldn't be planting today. So anyway, hopefully my old overweight, out of shape body will hopefully miraculously heal itself quickly.
I got a comment that came in, Lance, text message from one of our viewers.
Said,
so they should have hired a fence contractor. Oddly enough, he happens to be a fencing guy.
Well, ask him if he hand temps hedge posts, because that's the way I like to build my fence. So anyway, thanks for the good-natured ribbing, and I do feel a little better than I did 2 days ago when I actually injured myself. So hopefully I'm on the mend. But anyway, we'll kind of keep going on our list of things here, and again, if you have questions, please chat them in. So I'll touch on crown rot potential. So last year we really felt that the severe incidence of crown rot we had in a lot of corn was attributed to the early cold, wet conditions following planting. And what are we looking at this year if you've got corn in the ground, but cold, wet conditions following planting? So that is not a guarantee that crown rot is going to be bad, because other things have to happen through the growing season to make it really explode and express itself. But I do think that we are having, once again, the perfect spring for the boogeyman of crown rot to be impacting our corn. So if you've got early planted corn in the ground, and if you were not planning on doing an early vegetative fungicide application, and by early vegetative, I'm talking something in the V5, V6, V7 range, might be something to consider on that corn that is probably going to be pressured by crown rot. If you're trying some in-furrow products like a Xyway or some other fungicide treatment, might be a good opportunity to put those products to the test, and hopefully you've got some check strips left on your farm to where you can have a side-by-side comparison of with versus without on those. And the way we like to evaluate crown rot is multiple ways. You can certainly evaluate the yield. In a lot of cases, the plant health differences might be more noticeable than the yield differences. It depends on how severe it is. But one of the best ways to evaluate crown rot is to do a percent of plants infected. And the way you do that is, prior to harvest. So I'm going to say, sometime in the prior to black layer stage, but close to maturity, if you go out and either do a push test on the stalk, just take the stalk and try to lean the tassel over to the next row. If you can lean that tassel over to the next row and let go, and the plant springs back, there's no crown rot in that plant. Another way you can do it is what we call just a kick test. And this is Chris Callowell has fun doing this. Chris is a very high energy guy, so he goes crazy kicking corn stalks in his crown rot trials. But you grab onto that plant and the stalk right in front of you, and you just kick the base of the stalk with your toe. Well, be careful demonstrating that with a sprained ankle. That really hurt. So anyway, kick the base of the plant with your toe. And if it's a crown rot infested plant, you're just going to bust that stalk off at the ground and you don't have to kick it hard. You can even kick it with a sprained ankle, and it would still break off if it's a crown rot infected plant. The other way you can evaluate is count ghosted plants. So if you count 100 plants, let's say, in your treatment area, and 20% of those plants have died prematurely or ghosted, they're easy to see. You got a dead brown plant right next to a green healthy plant. Those dead brown plants are the ghosted plants. Those are the crown rot infected plants. Those are the plants you're losing yield on. Those are the plants with shallow, lighter kernels. Those are the plants that if you've got a high percentage of them, that's where your yield is going away in those ghosted plants. And then if you go over into a treatment that you've done, either a V5 fungicide application or an in-furrow treatment, and you count 100 plants and you find that you've got 10 ghosted plants, well, that's a 50% reduction in ghosted plants, going from 20% down to 10%. And so that's another way that we evaluate. And then obviously there's yield. So you can do push test, you can do kick test, you can count ghosted plants, and then ultimately you can compare the yield. And that's what I would encourage anybody to do if you want to evaluate a management, what impact is a management practice having on suppressing crown rot. So I think that's all I'll say about crown rot at the time. We touched on rainfall and forecast. To touch on weed control here a little bit. So obviously it's so cold. The weeds aren't really growing either. The winter annuals are slowly getting greener. I'm not seeing fields that look like a pasture yet, although I think we're forecasted to hit 80 on Saturday, which I'm going to be sweating at 80 because we are not acclimated to 80 yet for sure with all the cool weather we've had. So we got some warm days coming up. We've got the moisture. I mean, these fields are going to get green in a hurry. And I think a lot of people were, maybe hoping not to need a burn down, or maybe could get by with a cheap burn down, or cut the rate, trying to save a little money, trying to stretch product. And a wet late spring is not really what we wanted to stretch our glyphosate supplies this year. But just keep in mind, if you were planning on a bare bones burn down, the bigger and greener stuff gets, the more help you're going to need in that burn down application. So obviously, if you've got extend soybeans, you've got a dicamba option to add into your burn down. If you don't, you've got a 2,4-D option you can add into your burn down. The bigger stuff gets and the greener stuff gets, the higher the rate of glyphosate you're going to want in that burn down. So just keep in mind that if your plan A was to spray a residual product that has some burn down activity, that's not going to take out foot tall weeds out there if things get really green and really rank. So just keep that in mind. So we'll talk a little bit about cold stress versus imbibitional chilling. So imbibitional would be the fancy word for this morning's Ask the Agronomist, and really all imbibe is just a fancy term for the seed absorbing, soaking up water. That occurs without any effort from the seed. If you put a dry seed in a moist soil, it immediately starts to imbibe water. And where we get into imbibitional chilling is when that water that seed starts to soak up or imbibe is really, really cold. That causes damage to membranes. So the membranes start to stretch as the seed imbibes. And if it's really cold and they're stretching, they rupture. And some of those cellular, internal cellular components kind of leak out into the system. That causes damage, causes stress. That is a stress that just makes that seed weaker. The weaker the seed was to begin with, the more damage that imbibitional chilling can cause. What we're experiencing this year isn't necessarily what I would call classical imbibitional chilling. What we're experiencing this year is just cold stress. It's just a cold soil. That soil has not seen 50 degrees yet in most situations. Growth occurs below 50 degrees. So we've talked about 50-degree soil temperature. 50-degree soil temperature is not where growth begins. 50-degree soil is where reasonable rate of growth occurs. Corn will actually grow down to about 42-degree soil. It just grows so slowly. It takes forever at that soil temperature. And if you're at sub 50-degree soil temperature for the entire time, it's going to take over 3 weeks, maybe up to 4 weeks, to accumulate enough heat units in that cold soil to get that seed out of the ground. Another question that I get a lot that this would be an opportune time to mention is, when I'm calculating growing degree units early in the season, do I use soil temperature or air temperature? And actually, you are far more accurate at predicting emergence if you're using soil temperature for your growing degree unit calculations, actually up to about V6. Because up to about V6, that corn plant is living more off of the soil than it is off of the air temperature. The air temperature varies a lot more than soil temperature. The air temperature typically gets lower at night, higher in the day. The soil temp doesn't vary as much as the air temperature does. We generally almost always use air temperature, for our calculations because we've got access to air temperature so much easier. But if you've got access to soil temperature data, when you're trying to predict emergence, it's actually going to be driven off of soil temperature, not air temperature. So we say it takes somewhere between 110 and 120 heat units for the average hybrid to emerge. And if your calculations are showing something different from that, maybe refigure using soil temperature data rather than air temperature data will probably get you a little more accurate in that. But the cold stress that we're experiencing, all that's doing is it slows the process down. And the longer it takes for a seed to get out of the soil, the longer it takes for a seed to accumulate 110 to 120 heat units, the more likely something bad is to happen. And so what cold stress does, it just slows the process down. It adds stress. It makes it more difficult, makes it take more time, increases the likelihood that you get a little bit of soil crusting at some point before the seed gets out of the ground. The seed's already weakened because it's been laying in cold, wet soil for 3.5 weeks. And it's not going to have a lot of energy to push through a crusted soil situation. And so sometimes that's a factor. Other times we'll get it to the spike as it's coming up gets weaker. And so you're more likely for it to leaf out underground. At some point, it is going to leaf out underground no matter what. So kind of the last gasp, last ditch effort of that plant to survive right before it gives up, it's just going to leaf out, whether it's out of the ground or not. So in some cases, sometimes seed quality gets blamed on leafing out underground. Sometimes herbicides get blamed on leafing out underground. The reality is every plant is, if it doesn't die, it's either going to emerge or it's going to leaf out underground. And that's not always a sign of a seed quality problem or a sign of herbicide injury. Both of those can be factors in that. Back before seed companies and herbicide companies tended to be the same company, there was a lot more finger pointing going on. The seed guy would always blame the herbicide, and the herbicide guy would blame the seed. And when the herbicide guy and the seed guy became the same guy, that got more difficult to do. So not as much of that finger pointing going on as maybe there was in the good old days. So another question that always comes up, especially when we start getting a little bit late, is, well, what about maturity order? If I had my wish, would I start with my full season or would I start with my early? And some of you are going to say that you disagree vehemently with what I'm going to say, but I believe in both crops you should plant early to late. So I would argue that if you're going to plant some early beans, you need to plant those first. If you're going to plant short season corn, you need to plant that first. I know, especially in corn, there is the desire to get that full season stuff in the ground early so that it's not too wet. But the reason you're planting a spread of maturities in corn is to give yourself a harvest spread at harvest. And if you plant your 120-day corn first and your 105-day corn last, you're going to smush all that together at harvest time, and you don't really want to be planting early corn late. If you got to plant corn late, I would much rather it be full season corn. So start with your early, work to your later. Same thing on soybeans. There's kind of a fad right now with early beans early, and people feeling that the secret to making early beans yield is to get them planted early. And I understand the rationale for that. There is a totally different school of thought that people that believe that, no, if you're going to plant beans really early, you need to plant full season beans because full season beans respond better to early planting. The work we've done actually shows as a percentage of yield, a group 2 and a group 4 respond the same to early planting. So if the group 2 was going to yield 70 and the group 4 was going to yield 75, you might get a bigger bushel increase out of the group 4 or the full season bean than you do the early bean. But as a percentage, they're going to go up or down fairly similarly. So when we've looked at maturity response to planting date, we haven't seen a tremendous difference. Whether it's a group 2, group 3, or group 4, all soybeans respond to early planting. And we don't necessarily see a bigger response, based on the maturity. So it is true that if you want to give your early soybeans a competitive advantage versus your full season soybeans, if you plant the early bean early, it's more likely to yield as well as a later bean planted later. But on any given planting date, if you planted a 2.9 on April 5th and a 3.9 on April 5th, I'm going to give the 3.9 pretty good odds of out yielding the 2.9. But if you plant the 2.9 on April 5th and the 3.9 on May 10th, you might get the 2.9 to yield as well or better than the 3.9. So that's just a few thoughts on how to think about planting. But I definitely, don't want to see anybody, get stuck planting Group 2 soybeans in June if you can keep from it. And if you start with your full season beans and then we get a long delay, there is a chance that you could end up finishing with your early beans. Most of us are planting treated seed, and most of us have the seed that's been treated since probably March. And if June rolls around, you're still going to need to plant that seed because it's treated. And so that's another good reason to plant your early beans first, is just to eliminate the risk of planting your early beans last is what I would really like to avoid. So we kind of touched on the corn and bean first. We kind of touched on planting date. We touched on our farm safety update. So that was the part of me making fun of myself for spraining my ankle. But in all seriousness, as the season gets late, as the season gets compressed, as people get frustrated, as people get concerned, worried, nervous, sometimes the first thing that we sacrifice is safety, and we don't want to do that. So want all of you to have a safe planting season. So always try to keep that top of mind. And I hope we've got some questions coming in, Adam, or some additional thoughts you would like to add, or if you've had anything texted into you, because I think we could wrap up early here if we don't get some audience participation. So I will put a plug in for audience participation and see if you have any thoughts.
Well, maybe one thing I would maybe touch on is there hasn't been much planting activity.
That's right.
Sure.
Yep.
But there has been a little bit. What's your thoughts on the imbibitional chilling potential for what's in the ground right now? You think there's a good chance of it, especially if it was planted right before this rain? Or
I would say what I would call classic imbibitional chilling, we haven't had the right conditions for that. Now, we've certainly had perfect conditions for a lot of cold stress. So the perfect condition for imbibitional chilling would be to plant seed in a relatively warm, relatively dry soil. And then within the first 48 hours of that seed being in the ground, you drop that soil temperature rapidly with some cold rain. So we really haven't had a warm soil yet. We've had extended periods of cold weather, but we haven't necessarily had one of those situations where you got a 60-degree soil that plummets to 38-degree soil in the course of a few hours. So imbibitional chilling actually can only happen within the first 48 hours of planting. And you need really cold water. And I would say sub 40 degrees for sure. 38 degrees is a temperature that I've seen in some of the university research on imbibitional chilling. If you want to do some research on it, there was a really good article that Bob Nielsen at Purdue put out a couple years ago that I think did about the best job I've ever seen of explaining imbibitional chilling in a way that made sense to me, and did a good job too of distinguishing imbibitional chilling from just the soil is cold and wet, and what kind of stress is that causing. So I think we've had better conditions for just regular old cold stress. And there was someone that Nielsen quoted in his argument that actually I think was from either New York or Penn State, I can't remember, but some university in the Northeast that had done a lot of research on trying to distinguish between cold stress and imbibitional chilling, and they both cause the same thing. They both cause emergence problems, and a bad case of either one is a bad thing, and you're in a replant situation. And so this researcher made the point that he wasn't sure it was really even that important to try to distinguish between, was that imbibitional chilling or has it just been too cold too long and the stuff didn't come up very good. The problem's the same. The solution is the same. You replant when you have to. We haven't really talked about replanting specifically in this episode. I think we did touch on this 2 weeks ago, but I think most of you know that the supply of a lot of the elite and most sought after seed products is pretty tight, and you are likely not going to get the same thing you had the first time to replant. So if you're really particular about the hybrid or the variety that you want on a farm, you might have one shot to get a good stand done correctly. We've got plenty of seed to replant. That's not an issue. Getting you what you had the first time to replant might, in some cases, be nearly impossible. So we're still going to stand behind our products as we always have, but we cannot guarantee that you're going to get the same thing to replant with. So that's a real practical reason to not be too cavalier about, well, I get free replant, I'll get replant, I'll get paid by crop insurance. I'm not really losing any money if I have to replant all amounts a little bit of time. Well, if you have to replant with a product that wasn't as good as the one that you planted the first time, that is an additional cost in theory that you're not getting compensated for by your crop insurance policy or your seed company's free replant policy.
Yeah, we did have a good question come in. Lance Dirk Doctorful chimed in.
He always saves me.
Oh yeah, he's been great. Thank you, Dirk Doctorful, for all the questions. And he's wanting to know this imbibitional chilling scenario they're talking about, primarily with corn, is what we're thinking about. How does that relate to beans?
Yeah,
I think maybe you can address Dirk Doctorful's question and then lead into kind of the difference between why it is we lean towards in maybe more marginal situations early on in the planting season. We kind of like to have beans planted versus corn when it comes to stand establishment.
Yep. No, so great question. So I do think it would be probably inaccurate to say that beans are not impacted by cold stress or chilling injury, but they handle it far better than corn does. So physiologically, there's a lot of differences in the seed. It's a monocot versus a dicot. It's a starch crop versus an oil crop. There's just lots of differences physiologically between corn and soybean seed, and those physiological differences between those two crops do impact the way they handle cold, wet soils. Now seed treatments make a huge difference with soybeans. So when we talk about early planted soybeans, I'm guilty of assuming everybody's using a good, fully loaded seed treatment. If you do not use seed treatment in soybeans, things are far different. So one of the reasons why, historically, if you go back in time, we didn't plant beans early. We weren't planting treated seed typically with soybeans for lots of years. And still today, if you take modern soybean genetics untreated and you put them out there in March, if you want to demonstrate to yourself that seed treatment, really does do something, because I think sometimes some people think that, that's just somebody trying to make more money off of me. I don't really have to have that stuff. As it gets later in the spring, that becomes more true. So in a perfect world, if you're planting late, I'd go without treatment. If you're planting early, the better the treatment, the better. But if you want to demonstrate to yourself that seed treatment really is important, try planting some untreated soybeans in March, and right next to that, plant some fully loaded treated soybeans in March. And literally it is striking the difference. The untreated seed, there'll be like 6 of them come up. The treated seed, even if it takes 6 weeks to come up, you're probably going to get 2/3 of a stand or better on that treatment. And if you plant in really stressful conditions early, the difference in seed treatment is nothing comes up versus I got a pretty good stand. So it can be that dramatically different. But I think the reason that soybeans, we are more comfortable with soybeans ahead of cold, wet conditions and planting in less than ideal conditions are several. So reason number one, soybeans are actually tougher than corn. So we used to say that soybeans are tougher than we give them credit for, which is true. But they're not only tougher than we give them credit for, they are the toughest of the two plants when it comes to handling cold, wet soils. So a soybean laying in cold, wet mud will live a lot longer than corn will lying in the same crappy conditions. Soybeans can live in a oxygen depleted environment longer than corn can. So if you've got wet, saturated soils for an extended period of time, you will kill corn quicker than you kill soybeans just from being suffocated by being in a saturated soil. So for those two reasons primarily, that's the reason we've had such better results with pushing the planting window early on soybeans than we have on corn. And then when you add to that the fact that of the two crops, which one is more dependent on a good stand for yield potential? It would obviously be corn, right? Which crop is more dependent on having a uniform stand for full yield potential? Once again, I'd say corn. Which crop can better compensate for a thin stand? I'd say soybeans. So if soybeans take forever to come up, if soybeans come up uneven, if soybeans come up and you only get 2/3 of a stand, you haven't necessarily reduced your yield potential at all on that soybean stand. If the same thing happens to corn, you've shot yourself in the foot from the get-go, because there's no way that corn stand is going to be able to compensate for everything that it's been through. So for those reasons, that's why we are so much more confident, so much more comfortable. If you're going to push it early, push it on the beans, and let's do our best to get corn into a good soil that's relatively warm, relatively dry, and you have a forecast coming that doesn't look horrible. If you're planting a little wet, or you're planting cold, or you're planting ahead of a scary looking forecast, which would have been the case if you were planting Monday or Tuesday of this week. So Monday and Tuesday of this week, would probably be. I still don't think it's ideal conditions for true chilling injury, because we were never warm. I mean, the seed went into a cold soil that stayed cold. It went into a wet soil that got wetter. Those scenarios aren't exactly textbook conditions for imbibitional chilling, but they certainly are textbook conditions for stress and cold stress, and taking a long time for that seed to get out of the ground. And that's why a lot of agronomists would have said, if you wanted to do something this week, just because you couldn't stand not doing something, I'd rather see you planting beans than corn.
Yeah. That's a good explanation, Lance. So I had a question texted in to me from Dallas, and
Dallas, Texas.
Yeah.
Cool. Ask the Agronomist is going nationwide.
Yeah. So he's got a good question, and you maybe hit on it there right at the beginning just a little bit, but he's got a good specific question. He says, Lance, well, if I only got one planter on the farm, and it dries out or gets good enough to go next week. Which one are you going with then, corn or soybeans?
Yeah. So I had this conversation with a grower just yesterday. Exact same scenario. It's got one planter. His original plan was to start with soybeans in early April. Early April's gone. We're now mid-April. Looking at the forecast, going to be late April, maybe before we're able to get back in the field. And so that was his exact question. His planters he finished on corn last year, so it's set for corn. So if he starts with corn, they don't have to go, totally switch the planter over. If he starts with beans, he's going to have to switch the planter over. So that's the thought process he's been going through. I would say if you can start in April, and hopefully we're able to start in April for those of you who haven't started yet, and that's most of us. I haven't even gotten close to trying to put anything in the ground this spring. If you're able to start in April, I think there's an argument to be made that you go ahead and start with beans. So a couple of reasons why. If you're going to start a little on the marginal side, which, let's be honest, most of us do, and if it's late April before you can start, you might start a lot on the marginal side. So usually there's 2 or 3 days at the first start there that you're kind of wincing a little bit in some spots, and it's not quite fit, but the neighbor's already going and you can't stand not going. If that's your scenario, I'd a lot rather see you putting beans into that situation than corn. So I think oftentimes there's going to be a 2 or 3 day period there at the very start when it's not really fit, but it's fit enough. So if that's the condition you're in, I'd rather it be beans. The other thing I would say is, especially if the long-term forecast looks good, if you're fairly comfortable that you're going to have several good planting days the first half of May, if you're willing to assume that you're going to have some good planting days the first half of May, that's a great time to be planting corn. I'd like to see some beans get in the ground in April. So that would be another reason to consider starting with beans. As we turn the calendar to May, I would probably say let's give priority to corn. I would ideally not want to plant any corn after, say, May 25th. And if I had to finish planting in June, I would rather finish planting with soybeans. So soybeans are kind of miraculous in that they're the best crop to plant early. They're also the best crop to plant late. I would argue that corn is the best crop to plant in the sweet spot in the middle. The challenge is, where's the sweet spot going to be? And, last year we didn't really have a sweet spot. Maybe you could say that in some cases, late April was kind of a sweet spot for planting. Didn't end up necessarily being the highest yielding corn. It was probably the best planting conditions, but we had so many other factors that impacted yield. And I also mentioned this earlier in the program here, but year in and year out, planting date is not going to be what determines your yield. And we focus so much on timely planting, we probably overdo that, and we neglect to mention that there's probably 50 things every year for each crop that are more important than when you planted it that determine yield. So I would say, start with beans if you can. Start with beans if it's still April. Start with beans if it's not quite fit yet. Start with bean. If you're a dyed in the wool, I mean, there's some people out there that the world's going to come to an end if they don't get some April beans in the ground. If your quality of life is being severely impacted by not having any April planted beans, I'd start with beans. But I guess that's my thoughts on the subject, Dallas. I hope that answers your question. Thank you for the question. And I think there's a lot of people out there with that question that, if I haven't done anything yet and it's April 28th when I can start, what do I start with? And that's, I don't know that there is a right or wrong answer to that question. It's going to be a personal decision, and whatever decision you make is the right one. So,
yeah. And everybody's farms, and even on their farms, the fields are different, the field conditions are different. So there's a lot of different variables there that you have to weigh.
Yeah. So good point, Adam. If you've got some farms that are better natural drainage that are always fit first, whichever crop you're planning to plant in those fields, that might be what you ought to start with. So maybe that can help you make that decision too.
And I guess, the two things you just got to weigh, like you said, Lance, is what the potential benefits might be of getting your bean stand out there earlier versus also weighing the fact that it's super important to have a nice, consistent stand of corn out there.
That's right. Yeah.
So
and some of the research that some consultants have been doing shows that uniform soybean stand and uniform soybean emergence is probably not unimportant in soybeans. So especially if you're pushing your populations really low, some of the ultra low populations, I'm talking crazy low, like 40, 60,000, seeding rates in soybeans that some people have been playing around with. If you get your seeding rate low enough, uniform stand and uniform emergence is really important in soybeans as well. So it's not that it's unimportant in soybeans, but relatively speaking, it's a hell of a lot more important in corn than it is in soybeans.
Well, I'm not seeing any more questions right at we just had a response. Appreciate the answer. Some people, this particular person, thinking about leaning towards corn first, but he's right. If it'll be marginal the first couple of days, I'm sure. So definitely rather have beans into that environment. Yeah.
So I mean, the reality is, and this isn't agronomics. This is philosophy here. There's so much of it. There's still a stigma that corn is king. There is still a stigma that, people who plant beans first, there's still people out there that you look at you a little weird. Not me. I think you're smart. But the perception for so long was you plant corn first. And the fact that you plant corn first that's as almost ingrained as people's mind as test weight has something to do with yield. So that's one of Adam and I's favorite can of worms to get into. Matter of fact, if we got extra time here, we might just dive into that for the hell of it. But anyway, that's just Adam and I being selfish. But anyway, the thinking that you should plant your corn first, and corn deserves to be planted first, and corn needs to be planted first. There's still a lot of people that feel that way. And there's enough people that feel that way. If you're the poor guy that focused on soybeans early, and then you lose your planting season, and you end up finishing up corn the middle of June because you planted soybeans when your neighbors were planting corn, that makes you the topic of conversation. I always talk about the coffee shop. You can tell I'm a little bit old fashioned. I guess Twitter is the new coffee shop, I guess, but I'm not a Twitter guy. There is a risk associated with planting soybeans, on the early part of the season when you could have been planting corn. And everybody's risk tolerance is different. Everybody's philosophy is different. Everybody's, how you respond to peer pressure is different. But just be aware that if you focus on beans early, there's good agronomic reasons to do that. But every day you're planting soybeans early when you could have been planting corn, just be aware that there is some risk associated with that if you don't want to be the guy who ends up planting corn late because you were planting beans when you could have been planting corn. A lot of people have two planters. I've got two planters on our farm. We can't efficiently operate two planters. We can operate two planters, but as soon as one of them needs refilled or repaired, they both stop, because the pit crew to help refill or repair the one that went down is the same pit crew that's running the other one. So if you've got, a lot of people have more equipment than they've got labor. So in some operations, you can plant both at the same time, but you can plant each one individually faster if you're focused on one crop. We like to plant both at the same time. On our farm, our goal is to start with beans, do nothing but beans for a couple weeks, and then do corn and beans at the same time, and hopefully finish at about the same time, sometime the first week of May. That's my perfect season. If I could start planting soybeans sometime in early April, start planting corn probably sometime the third week of April, and then finish both by the first few days of May, I'm in heaven. That's what I did last year. Didn't turn out all that well because of other reasons. It had nothing to do with planting date, but that's, that was exactly what we were able to do on our operation last year. Take advantage of that early window to get a lot of beans socked in the ground. Didn't start on corn until around the 19th or 20th of April. And then we finished both crops in early May. Doesn't really feel like we're going to have an opportunity to do that this year. Who knows? Weather can change on a dime and change in a hurry. And like I say, there is no reason to get pessimistic on this crop. I know the markets they're panicked already for other reasons, and the later it gets, the more likely they are to start panicking because of late planting. But a friend of mine who's a grain marketing analyst, he did some research looking at the crop nationally, and it would actually surprise you to know that there's really no correlation between when the crop reaches 50% planted and the final yield. So when we plant early, those crops are not better than when we plant late. Now, if you do a planting date study, in an individual plot, you can sometimes see a difference based on planting date. Nationally, you don't really see that. So there are just too many factors. The number one factor for corn yield is rainfall in July. The number one factor for soybean yield is probably either plant health or rainfall. And we used to say August, but if you're planting soybeans in April, July is pretty important for April planted soybeans as well. So we've almost kind of moved the important part of the growing season up for soybeans. August doesn't make or break April planted soybeans the same way it makes or breaks May 20th planted soybeans.
No, that's all good information. I think it's great stuff to think about, and everybody's got to kind of make their own decisions there, because I liked how you put it, that we're getting into some philosophical situations, and so many different variables out there that everybody
Yeah.
has to weigh. So
Yeah. I like to say agronomy is part agronomy and part therapy.
yeah.
So
I just want to remind everybody we got about 10 minutes left here of the program to Ask the Agronomist. Really appreciate everybody tuning in today to check out what we're talking about. We try to keep the information, up to date, seasonal, but we're not afraid to talk out of season as well. If you've got questions about things out of season, we're always happy to talk about that. Make sure if you like this sort of thing, hit the little thumbs up button. Make sure you subscribe if you've got a YouTube account. Go ahead and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. We do this every 2 weeks.
Yep.
Which our next date will be the 5th of May.
5th of May.
Yep.
All right.
We usually do it in the morning. Start about 7:30, so we try to keep it pretty consistent for everybody. I know it works for some and not for others, but had a lot of people tuning in today, Lance.
Yeah, good. Quiet but big crowd today, so that's good. And just a reminder too, every old episode is still there. So we've talked about trying to come up with some sort of an index, so there's a way to know what's in each episode. I don't know how we could do that, but that's one suggestion that's been made. We don't have that, but you can go back and watch the old episodes if you get bored on a rainy day. And also, please, if you didn't chat in a question today, but you think of something that you would like to see us discuss on Ask the Agronomist, please email me, please text me, please text Adam or your FSR. Get those, get those questions, get those ideas. This is. I sound like PBS here. We're not viewer supported, but we are viewer driven with our content here on Ask the Agronomist. So also put a plug in for, I know Jennifer Elliott's probably listening, for our Yield Chasers Yield contest, and make sure you're getting signed up for that. That is something that we're trying to promote more this year than we have in the past. And I know sometimes as it gets late, people lose their patience to deal with stuff like that, and they start to get discouraged, and they think, well, I couldn't get it in early, so it's not going to be worth a damn anyway, so why would I screw around with entering a yield contest? Well, don't let that kind of thinking, stinking thinking, creep into your head, because we can still raise hellishly good corn and soybeans planted in the month of May. And get with your FSR to find out the details on getting enrolled in that Yield Chasers Yield Contest if you like to do that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yield Chasers contest is just supposed to be about having fun, talking about some different things we can do to try to increase high yields. Don't actually have to get the true sign up done right now, but it's fun to be thinking about it, and while we've still got time to make some decisions to affect those areas that we might be after. But I just wanted to say too, Lance, back to sort of the index or whatever you're talking about, to try to figure out what sort of information was talked about on a specific episode. If you look at the description of the episode, which basically to get to the description, there's a little drop down arrow. It's a little down pointing arrow. If you put that in there, if you hit that little button, Jennifer Elliott, who's a co-producer with me, she's done a really good job of trying to go back and just highlight what sort of things have been put in there.
Okay, so, awesome. Yeah.
So that one we've worked on. I think we've got some updates there that can help people find what sort of information.
The production staff works far harder than the agronomist does on these episodes. So appreciate Jennifer and Adam for all their help. So not opposed to ending a little bit early. So we'll give you back a few minutes of your morning. Thanks everybody for joining. And Adam, what was that date? May 5th? May 5th for our next episode. So hopefully we're all to the wall planting next 2 weeks from now. We will still be here. We may be talking to ourselves, but we'll get some good information recorded. And when you've got time, you can watch it if you're too busy in the field to join live next week. But thanks again for our live viewers. Love seeing the big crowd here this morning. And again, if you have ideas, thoughts, questions, concerns, complaints, chat them in, text them in, email them in, however you can get that to us. And everybody stay safe and stay positive, and we'll be back with you in a couple weeks. Thank you.